Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast, one of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todayswillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Wills and Probate podcast. Today we welcome Anthony Allsopp, Head of Business, and Simon Barber, Technical Manager at Title Research, onto the podcast to talk about specifically missing beneficiary insurance, but also the challenges that come with genealogy in 2025, increase in blended families and complex family structures, all the challenges that come around finding people who may or may not want to be found, I guess, at times. Great to have you both on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks for having us. Yeah, good to be here.
In the first instance, to get a flavour of who you are and what you do, could you tell us a bit about your roles at Title Research? First, Anthony, please.
Yeah, so my name's Anthony Allsopp. I'm Head of Business at Title Research. So I effectively head up the sales and operations side of Title Research underneath a sort of executive team. So I'm very much involved in the day-to-day running of the business. And we have two sort of fairly distinct sides of our business. One, our audience is probably most aware of, which is probate genealogy. So we have a specialist team that deals with the research that's involved on that side of the business. And then on the other side, we deal with international assets. So gathering in assets on behalf of UK states. And again, that's a very separate team. So I sort of sit above all of that and manage all the sort of new instructions that we take on through to facilitating it and hopefully finding a solution to our clients, which predominantly solicitors who are involved in some capacity in England and Wales and Scotland, potentially, of the administration of the states.
Thank you. Simon.
Hello, everyone. My name is Simon Barber. I'm the Technical Manager here at Title Research. My role is to look after the quality of the research that we do. I oversee all the missing beneficiary and genealogy research that the team do, and act on a consultancy basis as well, talking to clients about problems they may be facing with their probates and estate administrations. I do a lot of speaking events to private client teams about the work that we do, trying to sort of educate and explain the benefits of genealogy in estate administration.
So we've established that Title Research is a genealogist of some description, but Anthony, tell us about sort of the day-to-day work of Title Research, and also if you can lean into the relationship between King's Court Trust as well, because the two are intrinsically linked, aren't they?
It's probably worth me giving a bit of history, actually, because that in itself explores the dynamic, I suppose, between Title Research and King's Court Trust. Title Research, and for reasons I'll come into, we had to double check this recently, but it was set up as a sole trader in 1965. So we had to double check that because it actually makes this year our 60th anniversary, which is timely for this purpose. So that's why we had to double check it. So it was set up in 1965 by a gentleman called Tom Curran. And it was set up originally, and it was based in London, to adopt research for the purpose of finding missing title deeds, landowners and things like that. And it was based in London because in those days, that's where all those sorts of records were held. And it's kind of similar philosophy to a lot of companies that used to do company formations and things like that. They used to be based in London, opposite company's house. They could hop across the road and set up a company really easily. So it was the same principle with this business. From the research skills that it refined over time doing that sort of work, it moved into the probate field. So it started adopting those research methodologies to finding missing beneficiaries in wills, helping to resolve intestate estates where there was no will, no surviving spouse or issue, and we had to establish who entitled kin were that would benefit from the estate. And the business carried on doing that for a long time into the 1990s, when another gentleman called Tom Curran bought the business from his father. So Tom Curran Jr. bought it from Tom Curran Sr. in the late 90s. At that time, the business was involved in probate, genealogy, and as most other businesses were at the time, in undertaking that sort of work on a contingency fee basis. And I guess it was a kind of a moment in history for the business, because at that point, when Tom took on ownership of the business, he decided to sort of divest from that way of doing the work. His view was that contingency fees were potentially not legal. He certainly didn't believe that they were ethical. So the business moved away from doing that work almost sort of 25 years ago now. His brother then went on to set up Finders International, and we have this sort of interesting world of probate genealogists. But it wasn't until 2010 that Tom bought King's Court Trust, which was a business in Bath. And so Title Research was still based in London at the time, but it moved to Bath to sit in with King's Court Trust. And he bought it because King's Court Trust was a probate business. It was just specialising in estate administration and didn't do any other sort of reserved legal activities or anything like that. And he saw the synergy between what Title Research was doing, which was helping to resolve complex and quite niche issues that arise out of estate administration, and then buying a business that actually does estate administration. From that time onwards, we coexisted. We're separate legal entities, but we operate as part of the same business group. Total headcount, we're about over 100 people, I think, in total. Title Research is about 10-15% of that, and the rest is King's Court Trust. And they're one of the largest probate providers in the UK. So in terms of our day-to-day, actually about 5% of the work that we do is for King's Court Trust. The rest is for solicitors, England and Wales, Scotland. We work for some overseas clients. So for the two teams that we have, we'll either be on a day-to-day basis looking at new potential instructions. So solicitors will get in touch with us, outline a problem that they have that's delaying the administration of the estate, and that might relate to probate genealogy. It might relate to assets that they're trying to resolve overseas. So we'll advise on those. And we've got a team that does that. And then we'll have work that we're involved in, which is the ongoing resolution of those issues. So it could be that people involved in the genealogy side are constructing family trees, searching databases to try and find people, interviewing beneficiaries potentially. That's a large chunk of what we do on a day-to-day basis. So the work that we do means we have to write off to a lot of potential beneficiaries, and we have to interview them to confirm that they are who we believe them to be, and that their relationship to the deceased is as what we believe it to be, and that they sit into the tree in the way that we think that they do. And then we'll have another team that carries on with resolving assets and things like that. So it's quite an eclectic day in the lives of a case manager at Title Research, but that's generally what we do. It's fascinating work, and it's highly specialised. Not many law firms would undertake this kind of work themselves, which is why they would look to outsource it.
I've done genealogy podcasts with a couple of organisations now, and every time I do it, I find the role just really, really intriguing. And there's a certain type of person, I think, that's probably drawn to genealogy, isn't there? They've got a real nose for finding out information and sort of a bit of a dog with a bone attitude.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The people that we sort of hire into the team have sort of always got an inquiring mind. They've got patience as well. So it's not the kind of work where you can just sit, press a button and get the answer, and then you can move on to the next thing. There's often a lot of waiting, a lot of patience, trying something. If it doesn't work, try something else. And yeah, you're right, that does require someone who's got that kind of mindset and willingness to commit to it for the long term. And I'm sure if you've spoken to other people, other organizations, then they would say the same thing. But we as well are very fortunate in people do stay with us and do the research for a long time, which of course helps with experience. It's all about experience. And I think that's just because the work that they're doing is engaging. It interests them, fascinates them, and that makes them want to come into work every day and do the job. And that's a great benefit to us, because you can give anybody access to these databases if you want to. Anyone can get some results on a screen or on a piece of paper, but interpreting them and applying succession law and knowledge of genealogy and estate administration, that takes time to build. So that's kind of what we're selling, if you like, is our experience and our knowledge of how to interpret data, interpret results to get the best results for our clients that got the problem.
One of the things that comes up when I'm talking about this is, And you described the business as starting in London because that was sort of the center of the world as far as this data was concerned. Now, and you've alluded to the fact that, it's up on a screen, there's so much of this is digital, and things like social media must be hugely useful resources for you these days, whereas previously, obviously, they weren't there.
I've been doing genealogy for probate purposes now for 20 years, and it has changed dramatically from 20 years ago to today. Nearly everything is digital, whereas we used to be looking through old index books to get results and then go to an archive or to the Family Records Centre in London to apply for certificates. All of that is online now. So no genealogy company really needs to be in London anymore if you don't want to be, because we don't have to have that easy access to physical records. Of course, that's made it quicker, so we can get results quicker than we used to. And as a business that as Anthony alluded to, we'd only charge by time. That means it's actually more cost effective to do this kind of research than it used to be, because we spend less time looking through pages and pages and pages of things. We can just get a page of results to interpret on the screen. So that has been a benefit to our clients. Speed is always good for them. It's good for us because we spend less hours doing the work. You mentioned social media. I think that's really a double-edged sword for us. Often our clients will say, our client has found a Facebook profile for what we think is the missing beneficiary. Can you contact them through that? And the short answer is yes, but the long answer is yes, but we probably won't get a response. What you find through trying to use social media is you can often get a helpful lead, but making contact through social media is incredibly challenging because people just think it's a scam, or the message might not even hit their inbox. And, we're talking about insurance today. That's a bad thing from an insurance perspective, because you have an unanswered inquiry sitting in someone's junk folder or inbox that they might come back to in 5 years' time. They might have been the right person. They're going to potentially make a claim on an insurance policy if you put that in place. So social media is great. Certainly things like Facebook are not so great for us. LinkedIn, we sometimes can get good results because it's more of a professional platform perhaps than some of the others. It can give you leads, but then again, most of the time we don't know what the people look like. So seeing photographs of people's Facebook profiles or Instagram profiles isn't gonna help us.
Well, you've alluded to insurance, as I said at the beginning of the podcast. We're going to talk about missing beneficiary insurance today. Let's dive into, in the first instance, what it is. I mean, I guess it's exactly what it says on the tin, Anthony. We can't find somebody, or we've exhausted all the avenues in terms of the investigation, and therefore, in order to protect both the executors and the firm, presumably, we have the option to get an insurance policy.
Absolutely that. So it exists to protect the personal representative. And as you can probably imagine, it's not the kind of insurance that you'll find on Compare the Market and things like that. It's quite bespoke, quite specialised, because this type of work is very specialist. We deal with hundreds of different solicitors firms every year who administer, a variety of different ranges of estates. So, you've got your King's Court trusts and your co-ops up in the thousands, but you might have solicitors that only deal with, say, 10, 20, 30, 40 estates. The frequency of this type of work cropping up on estates is quite small. So although we deal with it every day, for a solicitor in isolation, they might not see an intestate estate, or they might not deal with a will where they've written to the legatee and they've not responded. It's quite unusual in their world in isolation. And the byproduct of that is that the insurance that's available to cover those scenarios is quite niche, and that there's only a few providers that do it today. It has opened up a little bit, but there's certainly not probably more than 5 providers in the UK that provide this sort of cover. It exists simply to cover the PR from any potential risk that a claim might be brought against the estate. So in the unlikely event that we can't find someone, which is quite unlikely nowadays, especially if they were last known to be residing in the UK, it would be quite unusual if we couldn't find someone. But if they've moved overseas into a jurisdiction that is hard to find people, but we know that they likely exist and they're still alive, then you can obtain insurance to cover that risk. Broadly speaking, there's 2 types of insurance that you can obtain. So there's what we would call comfort cover, and that is cover that's provided where there isn't really any sort of outrageous risks. The estate is just a policy to put in place on the basis that genealogy is not an exact science. So it's possible that we know that some of the indices and things like that are mistranscribed. So you have to double check different versions of those indices to get to a comfortable position. So you can just get comfort cover, which is usually about 0.5% of the value that's being insured. So a PR may choose to take that out, and it just provides just that comfort. The other type of cover that we commonly are involved with is what they would deem known risk. So that is a scenario where we know that there is someone that may benefit from the estate, but we can't find them. Again, that's rare, and it's usually when they live outside of the UK in jurisdictions that are hard to conduct research in. The policies and the premiums are usually higher because it is entirely possible that that person could come forward and make a claim against the estate in the future. So usually you would say those could get up to about 4% of the level of cover. But once they're in place, that's it. The PR can then comfortably distribute the estate. The policy will last in perpetuity. So if anything does happen in the future, then they've just got that protection. And as we know with anything in estate administration, it is the PR that's ultimately responsible. So if you don't have that cover and someone brings a claim later down the line and it's a valid claim, then it's the PR that's going to be taking the liability for that.
It's all about risk management as well. Yeah. And advising our clients, again, giving them the tools to advise their clients about any potential risks. Then if their client chooses not to go ahead with something, whether that's research or whether that's insurance, our client, the professional solicitor involved is covered, really. And that's what we've always... we're very risk averse. That's why we always recommend insurance. And that's one of the benefits of using a probate genealogist as opposed to an heir hunter, is that a probate genealogist is working for the estate and not for the beneficiaries, which of course can have different needs and different outcomes. And so by using a probate genealogist, you get that advice that protects yourself as a solicitor, as a legal executive, or whomever you may be, and then allows you then to protect your client, which is what it's all about.
You said that, in this day and age, it's very unlikely that you're not going to have either found somebody or established that there's a known risk. Have you got a statistic around what proportion of matters reach that point?
I 99% easily of all files we see where there's a missing beneficiary in the UK, we either locate them or we put an insurance policy in place. I think it's incredibly rare to not be able to find someone or to insure it. And the immediate things that come to mind are you occasionally, being asked to locate someone who's perhaps, maybe it's the deceased son, deceased daughter, there's some kind of more unusual social dynamic going on. Perhaps they leave a particularly unconventional lifestyle. Perhaps they're homeless, a lot of time in hostels, things like that. We had one where they went into a witness protection program a few years ago, and we couldn't find them for obvious reasons. And those very, very, very rare examples where for the best effort you make, you're not going to be able to find that person. And an insurer will look at it. The sums of money involved might be quite substantial. When you've got someone who's so close to the deceased, and such as a child or something like that, the chances of them coming forward to make a claim are extraordinarily high, because one day they may want to find out what happened to their mum, their dad. They find out they've died. There's almost a natural expectation they may have inherited some money, and they will want to find out what happened to that. And the path will then lead to an insurance claim. So it's those 1% of cases, I think, where it's just not going to be insurable and it's not going to be resolvable through research. But like I said, it's exceptionally rare now. I think it's even, it's rare to need insurance for a UK missing beneficiary anyway. It's even rarer to then not be able to get it.
There's the odd scenario as well where there's people who are incarcerated as well, which can be challenging.
Yeah, people who are in prison, you'd think they're quite easy because you can know where they are. They're supposed to stay there. Changes in the data protection laws a few years ago meant that in the past you could apply to the prison service and they would say, yes, this person is in prison, they're in this prison, that's where they are. Today, they need to get consent from that person to give those details out. You won't necessarily know yes or no that they are in prison. And of course, when people leave prison, it's not always a straightforward move from prison to a fixed address. They might go to a halfway house or something similar to that, and then maybe to a hostel, and then finally to a fixed address. They can be quite tricky to follow through. But generally, I don't necessarily see missing people in the UK as being that they should not be a massive problem to practitioners who are dealing with an estate now. There is a solution there, one way or the other.
And at what point does insurance become the alternative? Where do you draw the line in terms of how far you might investigate a particular estate there presumably is a cost consideration that needs to go into it. I mean, you've talked about the fact that costs have come down massively, but even so, there's a huge amount of time and effort, as you say, that goes into finding people.
There's two ends to the spectrum there, I would say, because it's not uncommon for us to get asked about an estate where there's a legatee named in a will, they're due a sum of money, there's a last known address, but the will was written, say, 20 years ago, so the solicitor may have written off to that address, not had a reply, and the default question to us is, well, we've not heard back from them, can we get insurance? Which is a reasonable thing to ask. Insurers will take a view that in that scenario, have all efforts been made and undertaken to try and find that individual? And they would likely deem that just writing off to a last known address that's probably 20 years old as not exhausting all options. We would always recommend, and based on what we've already spoken about, how it's not that, apart from exceptional circumstances, it's not that hard to find people. And insurers are well aware of that as well if they work with genealogists regularly. So they would recommend that you engage some form of tracing company that's got some pedigree in doing that work, because the likelihood is that that person can be found and then insurance isn't going to be required. If they don't advise that, then they are purely just absorbing risk, where there's a high probability that there is going to be a claim, which is obviously not a great position to be in for an insurer. Your question, I guess, extends to the other end of the spectrum. And, if you're incurring costs trying to locate one person or perhaps a lot of people, if it's an intestate estate, where do you draw the line with that? And it's a good question, so we have to ask ourselves that as well. Simon, you're probably better placed to sort on that side of it to answer on that one.
Yeah, it's always a tricky one, because insurers, as Anthony said, will expect all reasonable avenues of inquiry to be undertaken before providing the quote. And the definition of reasonable avenues of inquiry is usually different for each different matter that we see. So we always look at things on a bespoke way. So we'll look at, how much is that person due is a consideration. And if they're due £100,000, then an insurer is almost certainly going to want much more thorough work done than if they were due £1,000 potentially. It's not expensive to locate people. It costs less than £500 for us to find somebody in the UK if we've got a last name address. And that's usually quite cost effective. The executor is is obliged, not almost, they are obliged to undertake reasonable avenues of inquiry, and they're perfectly entitled to incur those costs. Like we said, it will usually lead to a successful outcome. In terms of small value, sometimes you might look at, or we often see things where the information to go on isn't particularly great, the value of the legacy is particularly small. Sometimes you can then negotiate an insurance policy instead of doing the research. We had a client recently, had some missing beneficiaries in the will due about £2,000 each. They had an old address in Africa for them. There was no way we could do the research either realistically or cost effectively. So the alternative was to arrange an insurance policy. So it's not, when our clients come to us with these problems and we want to put a solution in place, that solution might be, we'll find them. We'll find your missing people, you can pay them their money. But the best thing for the estate might not be to do that. It might be to perhaps try and put some insurance in place. It will be difficult if we don't do any research, but it's not necessarily impossible. So discussion with the client, look at the facts and work out what's best. That's how it should work.
So we've obviously got a lot of practitioners that listen in, or I hope a lot of practitioners that listen into today's Wills and Probate podcast. There is a growing understanding of missing beneficiary insurance, but can you just talk through, for the uninitiated, what the steps are that a firm might need to go through in order to look quite realistically at a policy?
Ideally, the firm would have undertaken some research first into finding their missing person. Let's assume that perhaps that's been unsuccessful. There's two ways they can go once they've done that. They can make an application to insurers themselves. Now, let's be honest, they can just Google that. I'm sure they'll get a few hits of that, or they can ask us. We'll give them some phone numbers. That's no problem. And then they can make the application themselves, or they can ask their genealogist to do so on their behalf. And so we will always arrange insurance on behalf of our clients if they wish us to do so, act as like an intermediary between the law firm and the insurer. We can do that because we're registered and regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority for that purpose. Often when I'm talking to clients, I always go out educationally. I don't go out to do sales pitches or anything like that. I always say to them, when you're doing your due diligence, before you instruct a genealogist, if you think you might need insurance at the end, the question to ask them to that genealogist is, are you able and are you willing to arrange insurance for me at the end? And if they say no, go somewhere else. Doesn't matter where you go, go somewhere else. Because not all of the major genealogy firms in the UK are FCA registered and regulated, so they can't arrange insurance for you. They can just push you away to somebody else. The insurers themselves will expect to see a report from a genealogist with whose work they are familiar, which is an awfully woolly phrase, because if you ask them to give you a list of genealogists whose work they're familiar with, they won't do that. And so that's not necessarily helpful. But in terms of pointing clients in the right direction, we'd say, are they FCA registered? Are they a well-known firm? There are a lot of small operations, or probably hundreds of small operations around the country, who will say they can do genealogy for probate, they can do missing beneficiary tracing, but their reports won't necessarily be accepted by insurers at the end, because the genealogist concerned perhaps doesn't meet the requirements that the insurer is expecting. An insurer won't like to see work done by the family, for example, because that introduces a moral hazard, a conflict of interest. They would also want to know, so when you apply to the insurers, they'll want to see the report from a genealogist. They'll want to see probably a copy of the grant and the will, if there is one. They'll want to understand any potential disputes in the estate and how much basically is due to this missing beneficiary or missing beneficiaries. If you've done some research, a lot of the insurers will want to know on what terms the work was done. Some insurers do increase the premiums if the genealogist has used a percentage fee approach for the research, whether that's an intestacy or a missing beneficiary, simply because they consider the likelihood that the work won't be as thorough, because there's no inclination to do all the work to a certain level of detail, because they're not being paid to do that. If I refer you back to my point about probate genealogists or heir hunters, because if they're heir hunter on a percentage basis, they're going to be representing the interests of the beneficiaries, not the estate. So that's something to bear in mind. And then the insurers will just consider the risk involved in the sum due to the beneficiary, what work's been done. Are there any outstanding inquiries? I know we spoke about Facebook and social media. That could be an outstanding inquiry if there's an unanswered response to a message like that. And then they should come back to you with a premium or some questions that either yourselves or the genealogist would be able to answer, which is about the research. Obviously, we'd answer that for our clients and say we've done this or we haven't done this and explain why or why not. If it's about the estate, then our client, the solicitor, the firm, the law firm would be able to say, yeah, we put Section 27 notices. So on this date, there were no responses, or can confirm there's no disputes and there's no likelihood of a claim in any other aspect, and we're ready to distribute the estate, all those kind of things. And then you get a premium. Like Anthony said, it's a policy that's in perpetuity. It covers the executors, PRs, and the beneficiaries on the estate as well. So everybody is covered. So the monies can be distributed, and no one needs to lay awake at night worrying they're going to pay some money back.
One of the things that we say to solicitors when we're talking about this area is also, we talk a lot about risk mitigation and management from a solicitor's point of view, whether they're named on the grant or not, so whether they're acting for the PR or whether they're acting as executor or administrator. And when we're talking about ability to obtain insurance, yes, we're FCA regulated, so we can liaise directly with insurers. If you're not, potentially you can go through brokers and things like that. If I'm being fair and balanced, the well-known genealogists, they're probably not going to have any issues getting insurance off the work that they've done. But we do see things sometimes where, it could be a reasonably high-value estate. A solicitor may have just be unfamiliar with this sort of area of work, and they've just looked for someone online or whatever it might be, and they found a company that says that they can do all of this research. They go off and do it, and then you can't get insurance, and that can be a real problem. To give you an example, we had one a couple of years ago where the firm came to us, and it was a company that had done the research. We'd not heard of them, in all honesty, but they'd incurred £45,000 worth of fees on that estate, tried to get insurance, and the insurer said, no, we're not going to insure it. And then you've got a real problem. The only thing that they could do in that scenario is go to another genealogist that could say, yes, we can do the work. We'll probably have to redo some of it, but we can then take that to an insurer. But all that's happened in that scenario is we've offered a solution, but in reality, the estate's incurred quite a lot of cost in that scenario because gone off and done some aspects of work with a business that just doesn't have the credentials to follow it through. So those are the risks. There's insurers that need to consider risks, and when we talk about familiarity and things like that, it is quite a big thing that they will consider.
Well, that's really interesting. I'm not an angle that I'd particularly sort of come across previously around the insurance discussion, and we're sort of fast moving towards the end of the time for the discussion. But just to finish off on this whole conversation, I said at the start that genealogy must be increasingly difficult and complex with blended families and changing family structures. I guess two questions really. One is does that bear out in your work? Are you finding it a more challenging area to work in? And Simon, you've got extensive experience in the sector. And the second sort of question really is how much does insurance have to evolve in order to move with the times, do you think?
Insurance is there ready for you and for people listening. It's there. And the products, if you like, are available. You just have to know that they're there and know how to get them. And that's where often you'll need a genealogist to work with you on that. Because as you said, it's the way families are changing is really quite fascinating. I often say to people, well, we used to do all of our work was big Victorian family trees. We'd roll them out across the office on big strips of paper and fill everywhere up with rolls of paper everywhere. We still do lots and lots of big family trees. Of course we do, but we do more and more really, really small family trees. And so often our client will come to us and we'll say, look, we've got this deceased. He died intestate, and we've got a selection of children here. We don't know who's actually his children and who's had a few relationships and a few marriages, and some of his partners had children from previous marriages, and they're all here. Who belongs to who? The genealogist can unravel that, and we're doing that more and more frequently. It's unraveling whose children belong to who, which just confirms who's entitled perhaps on an intestacy and who isn't, because of course stepchildren wouldn't be entitled. Illegitimate children would be, but then we need to prove they are relevant to that by the documents, which don't always add up.
Do you want to expand on that point?
Yeah.
We get asked a lot, don't we?
So the only thing we have really to prove entitlement is documents. Most of the time that's a birth certificate, might be some other adoption certificates or other papers that we might come across. And so for someone to be proven to be a child of the deceased, they would need to have the deceased name on their birth certificate, whether that's the mum or the dad. And often this occurs when it's the father, and often the father's name will be missing from the birth certificate, which means we can't prove that person is that person's child. And that is a conversation we're having quite frequently at the moment, because without the certificates adding up, we can't prove that someone is entitled, which does lead us down towards DNA potentially, which is not something that we do ourselves, but I know some of our clients have been dabbling is probably the best word in trying to get DNA evidence, but that just makes insurance even more important. And so from a genealogy point of view, proving who the children are is quite a quick an easy thing to do. It doesn't cost very much, a couple of hours work at the very, very most usually. So quite cost effective. And if it all adds up, you can then get a comfort insurance policy, which Anthony said, 0.5% of the sum insured usually. Again, often very, very cost effective for the PR to protect themselves. The problem then occurs when you have potential illegitimacy, someone whose certificate doesn't add up, guarantee that they're the son of the deceased, but they just can't prove it. How do you sort that out? Well, you're probably going to have to go down the DNA route, which is probably a subject for a completely different podcast in itself or webinar in itself. But even then, you're not necessarily going to get the answers that you want. We often see that DNA reports will say, well, this person has an X% chance of being related to that person. And unless that percentage is nice and high, you're still probably feeling a certain element of doubt. How do you deal with that? So these are all questions that are evolving and coming up now and will increase and continue to do so. We've already had to change the way we work in terms of making sure that we understand who can determine how many children a couple had. You can't just rely on someone getting married once. You've got to make sure that they've married more than one occasion, check to see who they lived with. Were they living with someone they could have potentially had children with? You have to consider civil partnerships, same-sex marriages, of course. Same-sex partners can have children. And we can't just assume they didn't have children because it's perfectly able to have children. They can adopt children. Unmarried people can adopt children now, and that was never used to be the case, way back when. There's so many different things in terms of social dynamics now that we need to make sure we are considering to minimize the risk to our clients that they're going to miss some of this.
Just to add as well on the evolution. So all of these sort of changing family dynamics are going to cause hurdles for us to overcome, but certainly on DNA and things like that and illegitimacy. But from an insurance point of view, I think insurance will always be available. I think what we will see likely is that the premiums will get higher to cover the increased exposure that the insurers have in these scenarios. So I don't think it's going to be a case that insurance just won't be available to cover these scenarios. The premiums will get higher. And in theory, the premium can be the total sum due. That is still a solution to anyone that's administering an estate. They don't have to pay that sum into court. They can hand it over to an insurer. if the risk becomes real in the future, then the insurer will pay out that sum.
A comprehensive wander through missing beneficiary insurance and all of those sort of intricacies that go with it, and really, really helpful to have the insight and expertise that you both bring to the discussion. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Simon.
Pleasure. Thank you for having us as well.
Today's Wills and Probate podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on today'swillsandprobate.co.uk. My thanks to Anthony and also to Simon. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast, one of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at today'swillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.